So the side project I've been working on in the evenings, I mentioned in the last video that I am a regular Dungeons and Dragons player. And one of my favorite things about Dungeons and Dragons are the world building elements. Some people prefer the main campaign settings, Forgotten Realms, where Dragonlance is set. I can't think of it, Greyhawk, stuff like that. I like making up my own worlds using these rules because it's kind of fun doing. It's interesting how rules can actually make you more creative. A lot of people are chafed by rules, but they can also have certain benefits. When I was a drama major, one of my favorite things to read were French plays. I know you're not supposed to just read plays, you're supposed to see them, but seeing them too, I had the exact same effect, but most often I was reading them because you don't always get a chance to see a production. And one of the things that amazed me is that the French plays actually got better after there's a French organization, the Académie d'Art. I'm probably butchering that. I don't speak French, but it is basically, it declared what was French literature and what wasn't, and it set up certain rules for how you had to write plays. The three unities: unity of place, unity of time, and unity of subject. It's been a long time since I studied this, so I might be getting this a little bit off. But the basic idea was everything should take place over a short period, ideally 24 hours. It should only have one real storyline, so it should be kept simple that way. Like, no, not tons of A plots and B plots and C plots. And it should all take place in roughly one area. And there are some French authors who really hated this, and I don't blame them. But the thing that was amazing to me was how many really good plays were written that followed these rules. Because they're actually not bad guidelines for keeping a focused story. So, by that same token, having a system like D&D that has rules that you have to follow and think about, or modify to suit your needs, actually can be very helpful creatively. I keep coming up with new ideas when working on other ones, and what I'm working on right now is the next campaign that I'm going to run, which is actually going to be Western themed. The whole idea, which fans of Critical Role will see a few elements in here that I did admittedly get from that, but it was a universe where magic was what made you rule. That it was I believe, what's the term? Magocracy. I just realized I've been drawing all these in the background layer, haven't I? Doesn't matter. All I have to do is move it up and rename it, because I didn't draw any background pieces at all. But yeah, it's a complete magocracy and a tyranny. Just an absolutely awful, awful world. And then a long-forgotten deity gave humanity a fighting chance by giving them firearms, which was the first thing that allowed people to actually fight back against magic. As a result, the mages were overthrown, banished from their kingdoms, and the common people took over. And so it's an interesting setting with lots of Western elements, so a lot of gunfights and stuff like that, with a certain element of one of the main tenets of the new religion that founds as a result of this, thou shalt not suffer a wizard to live. So it's also very much about that struggle, about giving up one, overthrowing one tyrant only to lead to another, and issues along those lines. And that is, as a side project, I'm thinking about developing that world in part through comics. Just some short pieces that I can show my players to give them an idea of what this world is going to feel like, more than just telling. That's always a nice thing to be able to do. I am going to copy and move this down because this has almost taken an hour already. I don't want this to go too long. So yeah, that I've been working on a little bit in the evenings, and it has been quite interesting. I'm actually going to turn down the opacity on that for a minute. But yeah, I mentioned Critical Role. The reason is the main religion that's come up is based around the being that brought firearms to the sentient races. And that figure is known as the Lord of Smoke. And I can't deny I was thinking about Percy a bit when I came up with this idea. Now, I've changed a lot, so I feel like it's not an outright copy or anything like that. I am also using Matt Mercer's Gunslinger rules in there, which has made my coming up with stuff a lot easier. But for the most part, what I've been coming up with has been fairly original. I've designed worlds in the past, and they haven't come together as fast as this one has. It's very exciting to me because, there we go. Yeah, she's slouching a little bit here. In the past, it's been kind of pulling teeth to come up with some of these worlds. It's been fun pulling teeth, which sounds weird now that I say that, but I mean, I can't think of how else to put it. It is a good time, but can be very stressful, is what I'm trying to say. And what's been funny about this world is, like, the last world I seriously created for D&D, I spent years thinking about. And this one, in a matter of months, is almost ready to go and is actually better developed than my old world. So hopefully I'll be able to get something good out of that, especially if I'm able to get some comics out of it. Like, that would be particularly great. Switch over to this layer, finish making that, erase, 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 erase. Anything else? Nope. So I should be able to crank that up. I want to check that wig, make sure that yeah, that's good enough. Back to here. Let's see, I don't want to talk too much about D&D since to a lot of people it's not interesting, and it is something I talked about a lot in my last video. But that is the other side project that I have been working on. It's funny because I mentioned the thing about how rules and constraints can help with coming up with stuff. The other thing that really helps me is watching something else in the same genre. Um, I don't know why, like this happens to me most with horror, but I've noticed that nothing makes me come up with ideas more than watching uh, a horror series of some kind, like horror video games, horror movies, horror TV, things like that. They always get my creative juices flowing in a weird way. And the funny thing is, what I'm creating is nothing like what I'm watching. Um, the best example I can think of, I believe what I was watching was Suspiria, the original, and they had this one shot where you see a woman's reflection in a mirror, and based on that, I came up with a comic. Ended up becoming, honestly, it's one of my favorite horror comics I've done, The Light Outside the Window. But it has that one shot is where I came up with the idea, and it's all about this relationship a woman in college gets forms with the ghost that lives on the other side of her window. Um, it's a very interesting little mini that I did. If you're interested in it, it is on my store in my mini comics section. But and my store is at bwhcomics.com/store. But it's one of those things that I came up with the idea while watching something completely unrelated. It was still horror, but it was not anything like that particular story. Just like that came to me right then, and I'm like, okay, well now when I get home I have to write it. I did a story a little while ago that I don't know if it'll end up seeing the light of day, but I was given a prompt in my accountability group for the prompt was stranded. That was the theme. And I came up with this really interesting comic idea. Like while we were talking about it, I came up with it, went home, and wrote the first draft of the script like immediately. I had to get it out of my head. And I don't know if I'll end up doing anything with it. I've debated, but there are certain themes in it that I'm not 100% sure I am handling appropriately, and certain plot issues that came up. For a quick story that I wrote, I'm pretty happy with it, and I'm glad that I made it. But we'll see if it ends up being made into anything. Uh, Basically, it was a story about someone who was a teenage runaway, and I was pitching it as they are in the wrong to do this. And that is kind of a dicey thing to do right now because there's a lot of issues with people who are homeless or runaways with legitimate cause for leaving. Um, so I was worried that I might be hurting the wrong people with that story. But if I give it some work, maybe at some point I'll be able to do it. It was an interesting story. And one of the things I really like to do with my horror comics, I don't have that line, so let me take a quick look up and see. Okay. One of the things I very much like to do with my horror stories is I do this in a lot of my comics. I do it in mystery too. I really like having black and white plus one other color, um, which is sometimes incorrectly called spot color. The correct term is technically single color. Um, yep. That's just me being a complete comic nerd and printing nerd. And this would have actually gone in there. I was thinking of using kind of like a sepia tone yellow, like that kind of color. take a quick look up above at what. Cool. And I think that could have looked. I think it could look good. I have some visuals in my head for what the comic would look like, and hopefully at some point I'll get to do it. Our accountability group is talking about doing more of those prompts, which hopefully will lead to other stuff. Like the most important thing from that is making sure you're still working and doing what you got to do. Ah, fix his chin a little bit. There we go. Looked a little weird. What other projects do I have in the back burner? I never did finish that 24-hour comic from a while ago. I really should do that. I've done 2 24-hour comics successfully and 4 unsuccessfully. Which is a little weird to say, because if you finish a comic, even if it takes longer than the period you originally said, I argue that you were successful. Since at the end of the day, you managed to get a comic done, that alone is pretty good. And but if you're going strictly off the goal, then yeah, I succeeded once. No, I succeeded twice, and I've failed twice. And it's one of those things that I recommend every cartoonist at some point do. Like, the worst that can happen is you fail. And the stakes are so low. It's one day. It's one day. And with the first time I tried it, I was actually back home in Virginia because I decided to try it on New Year's, and I go back home for the holidays. And what was, why? Hold on a second. Whoa, what tool is that? Yeah, okay, I did darken it. Oh, I darkened it to 70, that's why. That's what I do with my thumbnail. But yeah, socks on, just so I don't have to draw feet. I'm not as bad as Liefeld, but it can be a problem. What was I talking about? Got distracted by that layer issue. Working on projects. 24-hour comics. I was back home for the holidays and told my parents I'm going to try to do a 24-hour comic. I started at, I think I was actually doing it the typical way, or the traditional way, where you start at 10 a.m. and you finish by 10 a.m. the next day. And the goal is to have a finished printed copy by that time. People do all kinds of variations on it, but those are the rules I was going off of. And so my parents were a little worried about me trying to do this because they were like, this is crazy. If you need to sleep, sleep. And I was like, oh, I'll be fine. And what I tried to do is do a really complicated layout for what I was doing. like, complicated might be the wrong way to put it, but I was putting a lot of thought into it. And I was also doing it with nib, which I was fairly inexperienced with. And the end result was it took me about 11 days to make the comic, and I was shooting for 24 hours. But the advantage of this was that comic was 25 pages, because that's sort of also the target total that people go for. And so after I did that, I just made a comic, a 25-page comic in 11 days. And all of a sudden, 25 pages, which had been kind of a daunting amount before. My comics were usually a lot shorter than that because I was doing minis. But all of a sudden, it wasn't nearly as scary a number anymore. It didn't seem impossible. It seemed like something I could do in less than 2 weeks. And that was a big confidence booster. Like, I don't know if I could have made my graphic novel if I hadn't had that happen to me. And it's one of the most valuable things in my entire comic career, up to this point anyway. Yeah. So yeah, I did that comic, which was a classic story about the Wendigo, which is a mythological monster that I've become a real fan of. I like whenever I see the Wendigo show up in media. Although I did realize it's basically the exact same story every single time. Which does admittedly could get a tad old if you're not careful with it. Oh, I'm at an hour and 10 minutes. I am definitely doing overtime right now. Sorry about that. I was honestly hoping this one would be a little bit quicker. It's one of the other reasons that I was leaning towards doing this over the other one I was talking about. But no, that's not the way to do it. But it's fine. It's once again me talking into the void, and I'm completely fine with that. So the first time I finished a 24-hour comic was Nightmare was the name of it. The other one was called Wendigo, creatively. And it was a pretty straightforward story. I was thinking kind of Winsor McCay, who did Adventures of Little Nemo and Dreams of a Rarebit Fiend, which is a great title. And make the hair look like an explosion. And the whole idea was it's a little kid who's in bed who starts having nightmares. And I was kind of thinking of making it so that you could do an infinite scroll comic online. So all the panels it was just a 3-up grid. So panel, panel, panel. And if you were to just stack all of them, it'd be one continuous story going on forever. That's I was thinking that it could go up online and do that. Although, come to think of it, I never did that. I've always just sold it as books. And part of what made it work was I didn't really write out a script for it. I just did, okay, here's the opening, here's the ending, a bunch of stuff happens in between, let's figure this out as we go. I also did the whole thing in Brush, which I also wasn't familiar with, but which is very fast if you know what you're doing. Actually, I take it back. If you don't know what you're doing, it's very fast. If you're careful, it is a bit more meticulous, but it's one of those things where it was very fast for me to do, and I managed to complete the whole thing and get it out within, I think it was in the 22nd hour when I finally printed it. So I pulled that one off, and I got some sleep, which was honestly kind of important. Like, I didn't end up pulling an all-nighter. I slept. I was at the Center for Cartoon Studies at the time, and I slept in on a bench that was. Wait, I don't remember. I either slept on a bench or on a sofa they had in one of the outside one of the classrooms, just for a couple hours, and then got up and kept working. But I got it done, and that was a huge achievement for me. And it's something that the very next year I tried to do again, and I succeeded. I actually went much bigger on that one. That one is called Adventures of Kushonia, and it's a fantasy parody. The whole idea was a guy goes digging in his sofa for his remote and ends up getting teleported to a Narnia-esque world under his cushions. And it was very tongue-in-cheek. And the crazy thing is, I watercolored that one. Which, I don't know why I thought that was a good idea. But it turned out all right. In fact, I finished that one quicker than the last one. I also watercolored it at much smaller page size. The first comic I did, Nightmare, was at half letter, so 8.5 by 8.5 by 5.5. And the other one I did was this one was quarter letter, so significantly smaller. That's 5.5 by 4.25. And why is that important to you? Probably is not, but that's how I was able to watercolor it. So now you know. Would I necessarily recommend doing that strategy? Honestly, if you think if you can do it fast enough, I say go for it. I also am a pretty fast watercolor person. I came to art a little bit late comparatively. I'd always been doodling, but I always kind of came at it from more of a writing standpoint because I thought I wasn't a good enough artist to do the other side of things. The one thing that I'll say I do particularly well with art is work fast. And with watercolor in particular, I can whip out watercolors surprisingly fast and have been complimented on them, so I must be doing something right. Yeah. For the most part, I have kind of the classic cartoonist imposter syndrome, where you're like,